Thanks for joining us for our first episode here on Into the Weeds of current events. Today we're talking about something that is very contentious, and this is something that, in all fairness, Phil and I have talked about before. This isn't going to be a new subject for us. The immigration situation that we're dealing with right now, the deportations that are happening, and everything involved in that. What we want to do, I want to start by saying there's a very good chance that we are not going to agree on a whole lot with regards to immigration. So I think maybe what we should try to do is to be as Socratic as we can be, and each present our positions on the various questions regarding this issue as best we can, while keeping in mind that Phil and I are not enemies, and we are trying to come to some kind of find some common ground on this issue so that we can move forward. So let me start by saying there have been a number of situations involved in the immigration process, the changes that are happening in immigration with regards to specific individuals like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, right? And I don't want to get trapped in a conversation about those particular individuals. I think that a broader conversation is important. However, if we can talk about Garcia in a way that reflects on policy in general, then that's a good thing. I'll also start by saying I think that we will come to an accord during the course of this conversation on due process. This is something that the Supreme Court has weighed in on. Phil and I have talked about due process in the past, and I think that we will end up agreeing that everybody deserves due process, even people who are in the country illegally. And so maybe what we're going to focus on is kind of narrowing that down, the understanding of what due process is, what it means on this issue, and then also the places where we really don't have disagreement, or where we don't have agreement, rather, where we have strong disagreements. I would ask this. Let me open with this. I think we also agree that getting rid of criminals is a good thing, right? That if somebody has come into this country illegally and has committed crime, something more than traffic infractions, right? We're not talking about just, getting a speeding ticket, but committed real crimes, that I think both sides agree it's best to go ahead and deport those individuals back to the countries that they came from, right? So that's a good starting point. But that amount represents a small fraction of the total number of illegal immigrants that have come into the country. You're talking about, I'll defer to whatever your judgment on this is, Phil. I would say you're talking about less than 5% of illegal immigrants are committing crimes. Is that a fair?
I have no idea what that statistic is.
I think it's because, among the general population,
I wouldn't even know what it is in the general population.
it's like 1 to 2% or less are committing crimes.
Well, I know that this is something that you and I have disagreed on, but by my reading of the social science
Mhm.
evidence, historically, illegal immigrants commit crime at a lower rate per capita than legal immigrants, at a higher rate than natural citizens. And so I think that among the illegal immigrant population, they are least likely to commit crime. So if it's 1%, I would say if it is, and I don't know, if it's 1% for the overall population, I would imagine it's less for them.
So
So
I
that
would,
would be but I don't think we need
yeah,
to talk on
we
that.
don't need to get
Yeah,
into a statistical fight. I my
right, right.
my my gut tells me that legal immigrants probably commit crimes at a lower rate than illegal immigrants.
Right. And that's what
Uh,
the social science
and
data
that
says as well.
and the idea that immigrants as a total group commit crime at a lower rate than American citizens may or may not be true. But regardless, you're talking about a small percentage, right?
Yeah.
So less than 5%, let's just say less than 5% of illegal immigrants are actually committing crimes. And so the question really is, of the remaining 95% of people who are in this country illegally, what portion of those people do you feel should be deported, and what kind of process should we use, and what kind of criteria should we be looking for on whether or not to deport those people and how to go about it?
I thought we were going to be talking about uh, the case of Gilmore, um, uh, Mr. Garcia,
Garcia?
and that sort of That was sort of the first big case. That was a conversation we had before, not a general question about deportation. But so that's where I thought we were going today. That's what I planned on. But
We can
I'm
we can
I'm
talk we can talk some
I'm
about
but
Garcia. I don't want to get stuck talking about Garcia for an hour. But
right. No, agreed. And I agree with it. So I don't think it's necessary. I think his case is useful for what it highlights.
okay.
But so for me, um, as a general rule, and sort of to answer your question, I don't see illegal people who are here, people who are here illegally. Um, when Donald Trump, let me put it this way: Donald Trump ran on the idea of getting rid of the worst of the worst, and as you said, I think everybody agrees that getting people who have come to this country illegally, um, getting rid of them is a good idea, right? I do think it's important that we do it in a humane way. As you said, I do think it's important that we, and I think we agree, that they're provided due process in making that determination. And so um, I don't think there's any disagreement. Now that the courts have weighed in on it, I think both of us have acknowledged that, the Supreme Court, I don't know, today is Saturday, everybody.
Mhm.
Um, if or Friday, I'm sorry, today's Friday. I don't know that I can get it. We could get a 9-0 ruling on the Supreme Court on today being Friday. And yet on this question of due process, all of them agreed. And so that's something that's important. And so I think we agree people who are committing crimes, especially people who are repeat offenders, get them out of here. That's fine. We have to get due process. We give everybody due process. That's
Mhm.
what's makes America America. Um, as for the people who've been here, law abiding, they're in the country illegally. I get that, but they're law abiding. They participated. I'm not so sure that there's any urgent need to get rid of everybody out of the country. Um, and so I think that's probably where we would disagree on what can happen, but the way it should happen. I think the reason that for me I want to talk about uh, Mr. Garcia's case and then other cases that have propped up is that and this may be a point where we disagree, is that when Donald Trump ran, he ran on the idea of getting rid of the worst of the worst. And one of the things that seems to be the case, not in every case, because we don't know what happened in every case, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening. And people who aren't the worst of the worst have been deported. In fact, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but on the plane that was sent to El Salvador, there were actually 9 women on that plane, even though the prison in El Salvador is an all-male prison. And so they were flown out of the country, and the government of El Salvador said, "We can't take them. This is an all-male jail." And so they were flown back to the United States. Um, my bigger complaint about what's been going on was first the lack of due process. Uh, the way that the Alien Enemies Act has been invoked, I think it's unlawful. We can talk about that. And I think the administration has done a terrible job, an incompetent job at rounding up and identifying who the criminals are and then getting rid of them. I think that when you don't have respect for due process and if you don't have respect for the law, then you do things in a hurried fashion and you make mistakes. And that's what's happening. And that's what it looks like to me.
So again, due process is something where I think you and I agree, and that seems to
Correct.
be the main thrust of what you're talking about there.
So
And
like you get, Jubal, let's just clarify for people. When the government makes it, so in the with the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, what the federal government was doing was declaring that somebody was in fact an alien enemy as per the Alien Enemies Act, and then therefore subject to deportation. One of the things that the courts have said that there are certain parts of the Alien Enemies Act that aren't open to judicial review. The way the law was written, it didn't open up everything, every decision. There's a lot of deference given to the executive on taking care of issues of national security.
mhm,
There's also a concern that you don't want the government to have to identify the manner in which they've identified people as enemies or members of gangs. And so the courts are reluctant to make the government in a somewhat public setting show their hand because it could give away sources and methods and ways
Mhm.
that they're identifying people. So um, the question is, for me, what was Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act lawful? And then the second part of that is, have they been following their obligations to provide due process?
Right.
Right.
So and I agree that the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is something that we need to be careful with. We need to understand what exactly are you trying to say. But we do agree that due process is an important thing. Let's take a minute to properly define due process. I think maybe
Hmm.
that would be helpful here for the rest of this conversation. Due process essentially means, if you take the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment and kind of put them together, what it means is that everybody has the law applied to them equally without trying to either minimize the penalty they might face or maximize the penalty they might face, right? That would be sort of my definition of due process. What do you, how would you define due process?
I think I would go along with that. The only thing that I would add to that is why we have due process. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I talk to my students about all the time is how many provisions in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution itself were designed specifically to protect people who've been accused of crimes by the government.
Mhm.
So the reason we have due process is you have the federal government, this incredibly powerful institution, and when it's bringing to bear the full weight of its authority and its ability to use force and deprive people of
Mhm.
liberty against an individual or a class of individuals, it's like asymmetrical. There's this
Sure.
imbalance. And so the reason that we have due process, the reason the government has to provide evidence, they have to go before a judge and explain why they're depriving somebody of their liberty, um, is because to rectify that imbalance. So
Okay.
it's why we have due process is important as that we have the due process because the federal government is just so
So
powerful.
powerful. So, and I would agree that
Yeah,
the asymmetry of the situation when the federal government brings a case against you, you are facing just an unbelievable amount of resources.
right.
So I would say that even one step deeper as far as due process is concerned, into a philosophical standpoint on due process, that in America, that if you read the Constitution, if you read, the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, essentially what we have said since this country was founded was that people's liberty is not something that is granted by the government, right? The liberty of a human being is something that is God given or natural to that person. And the function, one of the primary functions of the government, is to safeguard everyone's liberty, right? And that includes people who are criminals or who are here in this country illegally. The purpose of the government is to protect people's liberty. And so it sort of puts the government at odds with itself, in the sense of, when the government wants to take an action that deprives a person of liberty, it has to fight with itself, in a sense, right? That's the job of the judiciary, is to say, well, okay, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so making law and then having it withstand the judiciary is part of safeguarding due process. But for my part, I want to remind people that due process itself is essentially just following the law. That Congress makes the law, right? The judiciary determines whether or not those laws are constitutional, and the executive branch enforces the law. It actually, does the things that the law says to do. So in a situation where we have, in this country, we have laws that treat different groups of people in different ways, and that is legal. And so it's not outside the realm of reality to say, okay, because somebody is in this country illegally, they're not a citizen, they are going to be treated differently than a person who is in this country legally. And what that difference is depends on the law, right?
Right.
So as long as we're following the law, we're doing things right. If we start breaking the law, then that's a problem. And I don't think that you and I would disagree on that, right?
No,
So
right.
do you think that at this point that this administration is breaking the law?
I think the implica- I think, to me, clearly the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is unlawful. Now, uh, actually, I believe it was yesterday, Judge Rodriguez actually was the first judge to rule on this. And essentially what he said, I read the decision. Essentially what he said is a lot of the challenges that were put up against against the implication of the Alien Enemies Act. He said, really, there's no role for the judiciary in overseeing or calling into question the judgment of the executive and the president. Um, but he said, when it comes to the interpretation of the meaning of a statute, that is clearly the role of the judiciary. And so in his case, he did this painful analysis that
Mhm.
I read. And essentially what he said is there is no invasion, there's no predatory incursion as far as that, the common understanding of that meaning. He laid out the evidence provided by the people who are challenging it. He laid out the government's response and said this is basically said this isn't a close call. And so he put a restraining order on the use of the Alien Enemies Act as a way of deporting people, um, because he says it's not it's unlawful. I want to be clear to everybody. He's not saying the Alien Enemies Act is unconstitutional, right? That's a law passed by Congress. It's been ruled on several times. The law itself is not unconstitutional, but the application in this case, because it has always been used during wartime, and the
Mhm.
specific language is invasion or invasion, predatory incursion, or incursion, through his like painstaking analysis, he said this is always involves a military thing. And so I think it was yesterday, he said that the use of the Alien Enemies Act is unlawful the way it's being used.
So
Um,
I haven't seen that yet.
yeah,
I want to review that. I'm gonna have to check that out. My understanding of the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act was that this administration was using it specifically toward members of organized crime that were involved in crossing the border into the country and committing crime.
right. But what he did is I mean, actually, Judge, for those of you who don't know, Judge Rodriguez, it was appointed by Donald Trump in 2017. He did what you would expect from a conservative jurist. Um, he kept his ruling very narrow because he said there are all kinds of areas where it's not appropriate for the judiciary to get involved. What he said was essentially that the plain language of the Alien Enemies Act is that it can be invoked when there's an invasion, a predatory incursion, or just an incursion. He said that historically, and then if you look at the debate that was happening in Congress at the time, this has always meant a military invasion of some sort, an incursion into territory with an effort to take over land or occupy areas. He said that is clearly not what is going on. Whether PDA is a terrorist organization, however you want to characterize them, because that's what Biden did. Biden called them a like a terrorist criminal organization, a TCO. That happened in the Biden administration, so it's sort of carrying over from that. He just said that Judge Rodriguez said that the application of the ACA is not lawful, and so um, this is one of the complicated things that makes some of these conversations heated, is that if the judge ruled that the invocation of the uh, Alien Enemies Act is unlawful, I don't know that we can take the step from there to say, therefore, they're being lawless, right? Um, you know, every administration interprets the law in a way that is conforms with their views, and so,
Mhm.
you know, if you go back to Joe Biden, his first attempt to sort of forgive all student debt, right? The court said that was unlawful the way it was originally done.
Sure.
I don't think it's appropriate to say, therefore, the Biden administration was being lawless, right? One of the things you do is you
Of course.
adopt a policy and you let the courts take their place. So that's what Judge That's what Judge Rodriguez, that was his conclusion. Now, maybe it'll be appealed up to the Supreme Court and they may have a different take on it. There's a separate judge also in Texas because Judge Rodriguez is in Texas. There was
Mhm.
another Venezuelan couple who was subject to deportation. Um, Judge, I think it's Briones, Briones, also said that the use of the Enemies Alien Act was not lawful. And so there are now two court cases. Eventually they'll work their way up to the courts, up
And
to the
that and
Supreme Court.
that that's how the system is supposed to work,
100%.
right?
100%.
So you did say something that I want to take an issue with. You said that Joe Biden was actually designated foreign gangs terrorists.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that EO. Do you recall what that was?
Yeah. Hold. I tell you what. Pause this.
Okay,
I'll
quick
find out.
pause.
Here we go.
Okay, we're back after having reviewed the facts.
So
Uh,
here, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh,
Oh,
so it works. It works out that in July of 2024, the Biden administration didn't identify Frente Agua as um, a foreign terrorist organization. They, in conjunction with the Department of Treasury, they sanctioned them as a transnational criminal organization, and the goal was to go after their financial
right,
networks and limit their operations. So that was what I was talking about.
right. But on January 20th of this year, the first day in office,
Right.
the Trump administration officially recognized TDA and MS-13 as global terrorist organizations. And I
Right.
think I think that they did that to kind of free their hand with regards to law enforcement measures that they can use. And like we were saying before, that may have paved the way for the use of the Alien Enemies Act. Whether or not the use of the Alien Enemies Act turns out to be constitutional or not, its use right now is lawful so long as it hasn't reached the highest court and a determination being made. Now, if we get to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says you can't use it, then and this administration continues to use it, then that would be a problem.
Right. And just to be clear, since we're doing this on May 5th, as of right now, no, it's not lawful because a judge ruled that the president's use of the Alien Enemies Act was unlawful. So Judge Rodriguez has ruled it unlawful and essentially put um, a restraining order on
An
its.
injunction.
Yeah,
So, but what's going to happen is that's going to be appealed,
definitely.
and then during the appeal process, I'm sure there will be provisions made that allow for complete or limited use of it until a final determination is made, as is usually the case. What my point is, what we need to be especially aware of is whether or not this is the Jacksonian effect materializes, which is that if the Supreme Court comes down and says no, you can't use the Alien Enemies Act, and the Trump administration continues to use it anyway, that's a problem.
And I would argue that now that Judge Rodriguez has put an injunction on the use of the Alien Enemies Act, if they continue to use it and employ it the way they're employing it, um, it would still be the Jacksonian effect because it is not the case that lower court rulings aren't binding. They are binding on the government as
Mhm.
they should be. Um, Now, the Supreme Court might have a different take on it than Judge Rodriguez, in which case their say is obviously final. But if they continue to use the Alien Enemies Act at this point, as of May 2nd, now that the order has been released, yeah, I think we would be in that territory of the
I
Jacksonian
understand.
effect.
I understand,
I don't
and
have any reason to believe that that's what's happening.
right.
Just
Unless
that,
there is some sort of provision in the appeal, right? If there is a provision in the appeal that says you can continue to use it until the Supreme Court makes the decision, then it would be okay. But what you're saying is right now, all use of the Alien Enemies Act needs to be frozen unless in the appeal there is some kind of language that says, oh, you can go ahead and use it. Sure,
yeah.
we
So
agree.
a higher court could stay the injunction.
Sure.
And so that's what the Supreme Court had essentially done when they ruled on it. Judge Boasberg had basically put a temporary preliminary injunction, a temporary restraining order on it, and they lifted that, right? So they lifted that because the case hadn't. The Supreme Court typically likes cases to work their way from the district court to the
Right.
Court of Appeals to them. And so they didn't rule on the constitutionality or the lawful implementation of the Alien Enemies Act. Instead, they ruled on um, uh, something that Jubal and I had talked about before. It was a question of venue, where cases, under what circumstances cases can be appealed and where they can be appealed. So essentially what
Mhm.
the court said is in Judge Bozer's case, he didn't have jurisdiction because the
He didn't have
prisoners were
standing.
being,
Right.
yeah,
So
he didn't. So he, no, it wasn't that he didn't have standing. He wasn't the appropriate place. You can't use the Administrative Procedures Act to challenge this law because of the way the law is written. That's not appropriate. And that the appropriate way to challenge the determination that one is a foreign alien, an enemy alien, is through habeas corpus petition. So you have to do it in the area
right,
where
right.
they're detained. And so
And
that
my understanding of that decision, that Supreme Court decision, is that that is going to do away largely with forum shopping with regards to this issue, right? That when you bring a case, it has to be in the place where it happened. You can't bring the case from some other region, you know, where that's not connected to where the event actually took place.
which I think is an interesting argument because I would argue that the reason they spirit these people out of here to Louisiana and to Texas, and that's where they hold them, is precisely for that reason, that they know that they're much more likely to get a friendly hearing in those locations than they would in Maryland. So I think they're doing a different version of foreign shopping,
Maybe
forum shopping
the and
in
if
the
that's the case, and I
yeah.
don't necessarily disagree with that. And if that is the case, then you know maybe that's also something that needs to be argued in the courts. I want to go back real quick to due process and just and make sure that we understand that, and that we're in accord that with regards to providing people who are in the country illegally with due process, that that means following the law. It doesn't necessarily mean providing them with a specific set of provisions or legal grants. Meaning, just because a person is being deported doesn't necessarily mean, according to the law, that they have to have a jury trial, right?
Right.
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 So they're depending on what Congress decides and what the law is, there are different levels of legal action that the government is allowed to take with regards to people who are in the country illegally. And so I do know that as a result, you brought up Garcia, as a result of the Garcia conversation argument, that a lot of people have gotten it into their minds that every single person who is in this country illegally deserves a hearing, and that's not necessarily the case. Can we
No,
agree?
that's definitely not the case.
Right.
Right.
So,
Some people have already gone to court, been ordered to leave the country, right? And the court has already made a final determination. They've just
mm,
evaded the law. So that's no different than somebody who was
has a bench
who
warrant issued against them.
yeah, exactly. So it's no different. The what the implication, it's interesting because you were saying you think that they use the Alien Enemies Act as a way to sort of sort of aid their process of reporting people. I think, in fact, what happened is that they made it more difficult
Mm,
because when the government determines that you're an alien enemy, that's exactly the point at which somebody has the right to challenge that determination. So
mhm.
the executive branch is the one that makes the determination that somebody is an alien enemy, right? Having made that determination, and then subject somebody somebody's subject to deportation, that's when the argument, that's where the right springs from. That now that the government has made this determination that they are an alien enemy, a member of TDA, that they have an opportunity to challenge that. So um,
Right.
I
So
think
you're
the
saying,
actual, I think that they did themselves a disservice by using this particular law. And I think I'm not surprised that Judge Rodriguez like I say, a conservative judge. He approached it like a textualist, like, this is how conservative jurists typically talk about things. You don't read into the law as something that isn't there. You look at the words, and that's what they did. Like
Right.
this pain-
So
painstaking analysis. So
you're
I think
saying
they
that
actually
the use of that actually, I think, makes a lot of sense, and I've not heard that before. The use of the Alien Enemies Act adds another layer of argument that the defense can make. Basically, it's
100%.
like you're classifying us as an alien enemy. Now that's another basis on which we can argue the deportation. So they're actually
Right.
making their jobs more difficult by invoking this act and labeling people terrorists, so to speak.
Right.
That's you know what, that makes sense because you don't need to label someone a terrorist to deport them, right?
Right.
Like if you're here illegally and certain criteria have been met, you can be deported. We don't need to call you a terrorist to be able to do that. And so you're just adding another layer of legal nonsense before the action can actually take place. That's a really good argument. So that's something I'm gonna have to think about.
Okay.
Uh, so let's do what is there a question that you have? Is there something that you want to talk about with regards to immigration?
I mean, no, one of the things I just like to say to anybody who's like watching all this is that one of the reasons that people feel like um, sometimes people on the left feel like we're being overwhelmed with these actions taken by the Trump administration. Um, Executives can move quickly; they can do things quickly. Um, the courts move slowly, and that's by design. And so as people are sort of getting worried and concerned about what's going on, just keep in mind that courts move slowly, and it's a good thing that the courts move slowly. We want them to be deliberative. And then we want presidents to act lawfully, right? But we want them to act um, in some cases, especially in a case of emergency, we want them to act quickly. So there's a tension between the job of the executive to get things done and the job of the courts to make sure that things are done properly.
Mhm.
So that's all I would say. I would say that again, I think that they probably shot themselves in the foot in terms of using the Alien Enemies Act. So maybe we can pick that up at
Yeah,
another
that's
time.
no, that's well, there is something else though I want to cover before we call this
Okay.
done. Um, I think that we agree. I think that we agree on that actually, and I know that we agree on due process, and I know that we agree now on the Alien Enemies Act that it was with regards to dealing with cartels in other nations, perhaps invoking that act has made things easier, right? Now we can start to treat them as enemy combatants in certain respects. But with regards to deporting people that are in the country illegally, I don't think it's necessary to label them a terrorist before you do so. I think that your argument makes a lot of sense. So let me go back to the original question that I asked, right? Because we still haven't plumbed it. You've got a small percentage of the people that are in this country illegally are committing crimes. Very small percentage, less than 5%, we've agreed. So 95% of the people who are in this country illegally. Do you think that a significant portion of them should be deported or should they be allowed to stay?
I think it should be handled like it should be handled on like a case by case basis. So like some people are here like DACA students, right? Or DACA kids, people who are brought over here. They're in the country illegally. They were brought here by their parents. This is the only country they've ever known. Um, do I think that they
Again,
should
you're
be?
talking you're talking about a small percentage of people though.
Well, I'm just saying that I think there are a bunch of different buckets. I think
Hmm.
one of the problems when we talk about people who are in the country illegally, there's a tendency to look at them sort of as like the same group of people, and it's a very, very different group of people. So, uh, people who applied for DACA, right? So, deferred action for child arrivals. Do I think they need to be deported? No, I think in some cases deporting them is cruel because the country from which they originally one, they had no agency in being in this country illegally.
Okay,
They were brought
let's
by their
let's
parents.
let's set aside DACA and
Okay,
let's say that represents another five. It doesn't, but let's say it represents another 5%.
okay,
So
I
now
think people
90%.
So I think the people who are here, because any administration gave them temporary protected status, I think to suddenly revoke that without them having done anything wrong, I think is unnecessarily cruel. So the
So
people
there's people with
who
asylum.
these are people who, yeah, and it's temporary. So let's be clear about it. It's temporary. But I think if somebody's here, they came here given a temporary protected status, so they're here legally. I think deporting those people, if they haven't committed a crime, if they're contributing members to society, I don't know that that's a, I don't think that that's a wise thing to do.
Okay.
Um, I'm concerned about, so that's another bucket,
So
temporary
let's say
protected status.
we know that 85% of asylum cases are rejected, right? That's what the numbers say. So somewhere close to that. So let's say that's another 15% of people who actually have received asylum or who are going to receive asylum. So now we're at
Mhm.
25% of the people that are in this country illegally. You want to go ahead and keep them here. 75% left. What do we do with them?
Okay, so then when you have like there was a case of a woman who was deported to shit. She was deported to, I forgot what country, maybe Honduras. But she was here illegally, but she had three American children,
Mhm.
right? I mean, so these are kids who are in America, born in America, they're American citizens. And so I think deporting somebody like that, if they haven't broken the law, I mean, other than being in the country illegally, if you have a family and that in order to deport, uh, where you face a family with the idea of you either have to be,
Wouldn't they
you're
be wouldn't they be DACA kids?
no, no, because remember DACA was limited. Not they purposely didn't set it up so that anybody who came in at a certain age, like a young kids, would these are kids, these
Oh,
are
so these
American
are
citizens. These are American citizens. This is
okay.
a woman who came in, had three kids in the
Okay.
United
Okay.
States. They're American citizens. So deporting a mom of American citizens,
Mhm.
um,
So
and
if a couple lives in this country, has come to the country illegally, has kids here, they should be
right.
allowed to stay.
I mean, again, if it's somebody going back to our original thing, if they're here but they're breaking the law,
Right.
then
Okay.
we need to figure
They've
out
come
something
here.
else.
They've come here. They're not breaking the law. They're following the
They're not
laws. They've
right.
had kids. They should be
Right.
allowed to stay.
They should be allowed. They should be allowed to say, or at least the bar should be high for why you deport somebody in a case like that. So I
Okay.
think there's just a bunch of different buckets, which is sort of back to the original point, which is why you provide due process, so that you
Hmm.
can figure out which bucket are you in. Right?
Hmm.
And that's what the court is good at doing. So I just think it needs to be done in a way that's following the laws, right? And that's humane. That's done in a way that's humane.
I understand. I understand. But
So the
of that 75% that's remaining, the people that are not committing crimes, they're not part of DACA. They are not asylees, right? They're working people who have come to this country. Of that 75%, how many of them have had children in this country? Do you have any idea?
I don't know what the numbers are. I
Hmm.
don't know what the numbers are.
Suppose
I
it's
would assume
half.
the law. I think that probably the longer they've been here, the greater likelihood that
Right? Of course.
the baby thing has
Of
happened.
course.
Fair
So
enough.
suppose it's half. I would guess that it's probably significantly higher than that, but let's suppose that it's half. So
Right.
36% or something, something like that. Um, they should just be allowed to stay, or the bar for removing them should be fairly high. So
Yeah.
now we've got another 36%, or say 30%,
Whatever the
that
number is.
don't have kids, but they're not committing crimes. They are not asylees. They're not members of DACA. Should they be allowed to stay, or do we need to give them special
Th-
hearings?
I think we should just follow the law. The law as it exists today. And as Jubal and I have talked about this, the Bush administration deported a lot of people. The Obama administration deported a lot of people. This is something that is part of the job of the federal government to make sure that the people who are here, people who are supposed to be there. So as long as the rules are being followed and everybody's been given appropriate
Mhm.
due process, then if you're here in the country illegally and there's a mechanism by which you can be deported, then you will be deported. you
Okay.
know, so I think that that's where we are. My
So,
concern. Go ahead.
no, I wanted to ask because I've gotten wildly different estimates during the Biden administration. What is your sense of how many people came into the country illegally during the 4 years of the Biden administration?
Especially during the pandemic, a lot of people came in. So there was a large influx of illegal immigrants during the Biden administration. So I think the numbers were quite high, which is
I've
why
heard
we.
estimates from 7 million to 25 million.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, these are one of those things where it's hard to calculate what's
Right.
going on. Like you don't know who came in that you didn't see and
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
You can look at the monthly encounters to try to get a
Right.
gauge on it, but it's
Yeah.
like, how do you do that? So
Well, you.
if we say it was 8 million, let's say it was 8 million, 2 million a year, it was 8 million people that came into the country illegally during the
Yeah.
Biden administration. Just, I think that's a low estimate, but let's just say that we stipulate to
Okay.
that. You already had, by all accounts, somewhere between 11 and 15 million people in the country illegally at that point. So at this point, we've got at least 20 to 25 million people who are in the country illegally. Again, I think it's probably significantly more than that, but let's just say that it's 25. um, I guess my first question would be 8 million people came in during the Biden administration. Do you think that that means that the Biden administration was incompetent with regards to immigration?
Well, I think they responded slowly and ineffectively to the wave of people coming in. I
Mm-hmm.
think they were trying to do things. I just think they didn't respond very effectively. So absolutely, I think that, I mean, I think it's a legitimate complaint that they didn't do a very good job. I think it may be it may be sort of Joe Biden's sort of predilection to sort of get things done through Congress. And so he
Mm-hmm.
initially wanted to pass legislation, have Congress set up, different process. That obviously didn't happen. And so then ultimately he relied solely on executive orders. He's very much a creature of the Senate. And it
Sure.
may very well be that that sort of tendency on the part of Biden to be more a legislator than an executive um, was responsible for a lack of a prompt response. But I think, yeah, clearly, I think one of the things I think we all sort of forget about, myself too, is how unusual the circumstances were that we
Mm.
were dealing with in the pandemic, and so we were faced with a very non-normal situation. So, but I did, so
I've
I think they responded. I think they responded slowly to an emerging a problem,
So
and then
do you think that it was, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, that the pandemic presented a unique set of challenges to the
yeah,
immigration system. Clearly a large influx, right? Like a
mhm,
lot of people who decided they wanted to come to America as a result of that. And that continued through most of his administration up until the last 6 months or so.
yeah,
So the immigration numbers from last month, we see that unwanted immigration is down at this point 99%, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, is that good? Does that mean that the Trump administration is actually really effective at managing the border?
I think, well, obviously they do a better job of preventing people from coming in than the Biden administration did. So on that score, you'd have to say they do a better job. Again, I worry about the manner in which they do it, and so I worry that there are people who should like be granted asylum who aren't going to be. But I think that that's securing the border is part of the federal government's job. So do I think the Trump administration has been effective at preventing people from coming over? It looks like, based on the numbers, they have. What I find interesting is I think that when it comes to deporting people, they've actually been worse than the Obama
Less effective
administration
than the Obama administration. Yeah,
and less effective than the Bush administration,
I think you're
which
right.
which raises an interesting question, which is a topic for another current event. And that is that in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, there were people who were working with the government, who were in the government, assisting in the process of deporting people. And so there was a lot of institutional knowledge there. How do you do this? How do you get it done legally? How do you legally deport people? What are the process? And so one of the things that I worry about is that with the people who've been cut from the federal government, I
All the
wonder,
people who knew how to do that have been dismissed.
maybe not all of them, but maybe a lot of people
Mm.
who had some institutional knowledge that
Right,
they could have brought to bear are no longer there.
right,
Or alternatively, having seen what's happened elsewhere, they've said, "I'm not saying anything,"
right.
and
And that's why they're tripping over their dicks with the AEA, right?
right.
Right.
So
That makes sense.
yeah. So what I worry about is that um, he's getting bad he's getting bad legal advice. He's
Hmm.
just getting bad legal advice, and so I think it's hampering. So it's interesting. The majority of Americans were on board with the idea of deporting people, especially I think because he emphasized the worst of the worst. We've used that expression that came from the campaign. Um, but what we've seen is instance after instance of people whose houses have been raided, people who've been deported who shouldn't have been deported, or it looks like maybe they shouldn't have been deported. And so they've gone about um, uh, implementing uh, a policy that's popular in a way that has turned people against what they're doing. And so I think that's it's an unforced error.
Right.
In the same way that Biden not dealing with the influx of immigrants coming in during the pandemic was an unforced error. I think this is an unforced error in the other direction.
That makes sense. So I think that at the end of this, that we've come to an accord on certainly on due process, right? I think that we're in agreement, and I think that the great majority of Americans are in agreement as far as due process is concerned, right? We all understand that everybody gets the law applied to them equally, that the law needs to be followed. I think we also have come to an accord
I
that
certainly hope everybody agrees with
yeah,
that.
yeah, because if you don't agree with that, then I don't know what to tell you. But
Get out the Constitution.
that's right. But I think we've also come to an accord that the use of the AEA, the Alien Enemies Act, was actually not a great idea. I think they've opened themselves up to more nonsense than they would have had if they had just stuck to the immigration law the way that it was. So as this unfolds, I'm sure we're going to talk about it again. But for now, the main thing to watch. Oh, go ahead. Go
Okay,
ahead.
but I appreciate the summary. I realize that there were a couple of questions I did want to ask you about.
Oh,
And
please. Yeah.
they're kind of gotcha questions, but give you an
I
opportunity
love
because
gotcha questions.
okay, there we go. So I'm sure you saw Terry Moran interviewing the snip of Terry Moran interviewing President Trump in the Oval Office.
I did.
And at one point during the interview, President Trump said that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, had the word MS-13 tattooed on his hand.
Hmm.
And he posted something on True Social, a
Hmm.
picture of his hand with these
Hmm.
tattoos on him. Have you seen that photo?
I've seen that photo.
Okay.
It's
Is it
it's
as obvious to you as it is to the rest of the world that that was photoshopped on?
yes.
Okay, good.
So
That's good. I think that's all I've written, and I think that's great. I
let
have
me
a more
just say this. Let me just say this.
okay.
It seemed like in that interview that Donald Trump did think that those were that the photoshopped uh, uh, word MS-13 on his knuckles, that those were actually on his knuckles, right?
Not it
Uh,
seemed like, Jubal. Not it
that's what it
seemed
seemed
like.
like. That's what he
No,
was
it was. He was very explicit about
right.
that. We can pull
So
up the we can pause this and pull up the video if you want.
I'm not gonna argue with it.
Okay.
The
He
He thought that it
believed
said MS-13 on his knuckles.
MS-13 on his knuckle.
Now,
And he said, you want to see the photograph?
right, right.
Okay.
So let's just say that he was wrong.
Hmm.
That he saw that photo, somebody showed him the photo and said, "Oh, look, here's Abrego's knuckles," and he's like, "Oh, wow, it says MS-13, okay," and he walks away from that thinking that that's what it actually is on his knuckles.
Hmm.
Uh, really, my question is, so what?
Okay. So for me, the reason so what is there are a few things about that. One is that this wasn't even a good job of photoshopping. I mean, it looked like it was like typewriter type on the thing. So it was such a bad
Somebody
job.
somebody puts it in front of him. He looks at it. Look, I don't want to get
So
into a
wait, no, no, no,
situation
no, no,
where
wait. So, but let me finish it.
okay,
So the so what matters, because to me, that is somebody who lacked sort of like the capacity to analyze things effectively.
okay,
I think your average junior high school student would be able to look at that and go, yeah, that's obviously fake. I mean, it doesn't even look close, right? Um, so what bothers me is that it bothers me that uh, he is one is that he's incapable of making that determination. You don't have to be an expert. You saw it, I saw it, everybody else saw it. It's clearly Photoshop, right? So that's a problem. It shows a lack of intellectual curiosity about it. The second thing is
I
that
don't know if that's what it shows, but go ahead.
okay, the d- and um, it tells me that that whoever's doing Susan Wiles is chief of staff. It tells me that people are getting access to him and giving him pictures and things like that. That there should be somebody doing gatekeeping. There should be somebody who controls the flow of information. Because if he's not capable of understanding that that was Photoshop, you have to be really careful about what kind of information he does and doesn't see. So Susan Wiles, who everybody speaks very highly of, me, her job as chief of staff is to control the flow of information to the extent that his management style allows that. So
Mhm.
the other problem is that it suggests to me that he's not being served well by his chief of staff either.
Okay.
So
So
those are my two main
let's
concerns.
let's see what develops. He may come out with a response to that whole thing, and we'll see what happens. You said you had another one. You have another gotcha
Yeah,
question.
this is a question that people haven't been talking about, which I think is an interesting question. And that is that the prison in El Salvador, as I understand it, is pretty notorious for uh, like really bad conditions. Like the way people are treated in that prison would never be acceptable in the United States, right? We have certain standards, even for people who are like convicted of crimes. So you can't, you can't do cruel and unusual punishment. You have to be humane, even in the way you imprison people. And I'm just wondering, do you have a problem with the idea that they're being sent to a prison where people are uh, reports are um, prior to these prisoners being sent there that CCOT is there are inhumane conditions there. Is that problematic for you?
I mean, it's problematic for me in the sense that I don't want to see inhumane conditions anywhere on Earth,
Right,
right? Like in a general philosophical sense, yes, of course. I don't get off on people suffering, right?
right.
Uh, but for the most part, I think that the whole purpose of sending gang members to the El Salvadorian prison and making a big show of it is it's a PR move, right?
Hmm.
It's a kind of advertising. It's like if you come to America to peddle fentanyl and you commit crimes while you're here, this is where you're going to end up, right? It's the same thing that Christy Nome has been saying, right? This is an option. If you're a bad actor, this is where you can end up. And what we have seen now is a dramatic reduction in the number of people who are coming across the border to commit crimes. I think that's to the good, right? I want to be
Well, we don't. Wait.
compassionate.
Let me. We don't know if there's been a reduction in the number of people coming across to commit crimes. We know there's a number of reduction in the number of people coming across,
The aggregate total number of people has been dramatically reduced,
dramatically reduced.
which
So, right,
includes all the people that are coming in to commit crimes, right?
right, which you agreed is a small percentage.
It's a small percentage, but
Okay, so
again, it's like if we had, let's say, 10,000 people a month coming over the border to commit crimes, we're now down to like a dozen, right? So
right,
that's a good change.
right, and what my concern is that when the U.S. is basically paying people, paying the El Salvadoran government uh, to house people in a prison that's like a notorious prison, to me, that's sort of comparable to, you know, Putin sending people to Gulag, right? Like that's just not what we do in America. I'm
I
not.
understand. I
I
don't disagree. I don't
so I just
disagree.
I just
Right.
the reason I'm asking this is because there really hasn't been any discussion about the morality, the propriety, the wisdom of essentially providing financial support for for a prison that is known to be cruel.
Okay.
It's just like what you said, Jubal. The reason that we have rights, right, is not because the government gives them to us, right?
Hmm.
We have them; they are inalienable rights. They're given to
Hmm.
us in theory by the founders, thinking they're given to us by God, and one of those is, there can be no cruel and unusual punishment.
Hmm.
It seems to me problematic. Say there can be no cruel and unusual punishment, but we're going to pay to taxpayer money and send somebody to a prison where that is allowed.
Okay, but
And
here's the caveat there though. We're gonna pay taxpayer money either way.
right, right,
It's
sure,
actually significantly less expensive to send these guys to El Salvador
agreed.
than to jail them here.
But I know that if they're jailed here, the likelihood that they're going to be treated humanely is greater,
Is
right?
greater. And part of it, they're part of it is a morality play in the sense that when you look at the rap sheets of the people who are being sent to El Salvador, and if you want to say, well, mistakes have been made, right?
Mm,
Okay, I don't disagree. There, in any situation where you have an institution that's dealing with tens of millions of people, it's foolish to think that mistakes won't be made, right? So we know that there are mistakes going to be made. How do you rectify them? We know that Garcia is no longer in that prison, right? He's been moved to a minimum security facility. So
right.
changes do happen. But when you look at the yellow sheets of these guys that are being sent to the prison, it's tough for me to summon a lot of compassion for them, especially when I know that they have been preying on American citizens, right? So
And
it's
I don't
but
know how
it
you've made.
but
I
at the
don't know
same
how.
time,
I don't know how you've made a determination about their rap sheet, right?
you could
Because
you could look and see,
except
right?
that for me, the way you determine sort of what their rap sheet is that that's where the due process comes in,
Hmm.
right? So I think that you would probably argue that Mr. Garcia is one of those people who is like sort of has this bad rap sheet, except that from what I've seen, the evidence I've seen, he's never been arrested. He's never been charged with a crime. So there are people who are there that don't have that kind of rap sheet, but mistakes
Well,
can be
but
made. That's
Garcia's not in that prison.
right, right. But that's where he was initially sent.
Initially, he was, yeah.
And so back to the morality question. We You say like these are bad people. It
They're
almost
bad people.
sounds
They're going to a bad prison. It's like I don't think that the prison in El Salvador. I think what you would find is that the conditions in that prison are probably not significantly worse than the conditions at a prison like Sing Sing. Like much of the hell that those prisoners go through is of their own making.
right. So
And I don't think that they're pulling these guys out and beating them with hoses. I don't think that they're torturing them or doing anything like that. I think,
do you think members of Congress should be able to go there and see what's going on if the
of
taxpayers
course,
are
yeah, if we're
okay?
paying, yeah,
So
of course. And
right, because
I think that they
be-
have. I think Christy Nome has been
well,
there. I think a number of lawmakers have
no,
been
no,
there.
I know, but some Democrats have asked to go, they asked James Comer to provide funding for them to go to CCOT to see the
Hmm.
conditions, and what Comer said is no, he wouldn't provide that. So you would agree that any they're called co-delegations. You think it would be appropriate, since U.S. taxpayers are paying for them to be there, that Democratic and Republican members of Congress, if they want to go see the conditions in that prison, they should not be prevented from doing so.
Are they being prevented?
Yeah, well, what Homer did was that they wanted to do a trip, and because
Mhm.
the Republicans control the majority party, he basically denied their request. So
Okay.
apparently they're going to provide funding from other sources. So I think they're going to do their own
Okay.
funding.
Yeah.
But I don't think. But it seems to me that if the taxpayers are paying for them to be kept in this prison, that any member of Congress who wants to go there should be able to see what is it the taxpayers are paying for.
Sure.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Cool.
is
I
it,
got,
but is it something that the taxpayers should have to pay for? If you want to go to the prison and have a PR moment, if you want, Cory Booker to go and talk for 25 hours in front of the prison, do the taxpayers need to pay for his lunch and his plane ticket? I don't think they do.
I mean, I think that when, I think that if they're going there for investigative purposes,
Is that why they're
then
going there?
I think so. I think
Okay,
they went,
if they want to do an investigation, if you want to take some video cameras and investigate the prison and do a report, an objective report, a
right.
a two party, equal amounts of Democrats and Republicans, and go
Yeah.
to the prison and say, let's document it, let's do it. I'm all for that. I'd love to see that. Let's have a
Right.
special on the Discovery
By
Channel.
the way,
But if you want to go to the prison and have a PR moment and talk about, justice,
is that what Christy Nome was doing? Was she doing a PR moment?
if she was, then she should have paid for it out of her own pocket.
She was standing in front of a cell of people,
Hmm.
had a picture taken in front of the cell where people were like lined up. It
Hmm.
was entirely a PR moment, a PR shot.
Hmm.
Um, Oddly enough, wearing like a very, very expensive watch, which was kind of weird. But in any case, and then Republican members of Congress were allowed in
Hmm.
as well, but Democrats weren't. So
They weren't
you would
allowed in, or they weren't.
they
It
weren't
wasn't.
they it was the from what I understand, the Oversight Committee approved the Republicans going, but wouldn't approve the Democrats going.
Hmm.
So you would agree that if
Let's get a
those are the
bipartisan prison analysis team together. Send them in there with
okay,
some cameras and check it out.
good.
I'm all for
I
it.
don't know that they can bring cameras in, but I think
Okay.
they should be able, right? I think there are going to be certain rules about
I
what
think
you
I
can
th-
and can't do.
I think that something that basically compassion is something that we all want to have. It is, it's a good thing to have. But if you're going to apply it, you should apply it universally in the sense that we should also be having compassion for the people who have suffered from the crimes that these guys have committed,
100%
right?
agree. Right.
So again, I go back to what I said when you first asked the question: is that in a general philosophical human way, I don't want anybody to suffer. I don't, right?
Right.
But if using this prison in this way saves the taxpayers a significant amount of money, and it does, saves us a lot of money, um, I'm kind of okay with it.
Yeah. And so let me just go on record saying I'm not.
I understand.
I don't want to save money, and in doing so, like I say, the rights that we have in the Constitution are inalienable rights. We believe that we have them by virtue of being human
Mhm.
beings. And so if we're paying to have somebody else house our criminals, I
Mhm.
think I would be more comfortable to say, look, how you handle your foreign nationals is fine, but if we're paying for the service, these are the
Right.
rules, and they should be
No, I get
treated
it, and I think
humanely.
that's something that is common to a lot of people in the Democratic Party. You have no problem paying a lot more money if it makes you more comfortable.
If it's not just me being comfortable living up to our ideals and living up to the standards that to me make America America, that's what I'm talking about. So it's not a question of comfort or a lack of comfort. It's whether or not we're going to be what Reagan called that shining city on a hill.
Mhm.
We're going to be the place that upholds these values um, all the time, all the time. And so
All right,
that
and
that
I'll give you this: if we send a crew over there and they do find, torturous conditions, and then I'll sign on the dotted line and say, look, we'll pay you even more money if you don't do that, right? I'll be on board with that.
good. And then so the main thing would be that you would agree that if
Ideally,
a, de-
you should have a
a bipartisan
completely.
delegation,
I agree with that, and ideally, you should have completely humane conditions.
right?
But right now, I'm call it what you want, but I am really less concerned with the well-being of these criminal gang members than I am with the people in the United States.
And for
And
me, if I was convinced that the people who were sent over were criminal gang members, I would still be concerned about it. But there is good reason to believe that there are some people who aren't criminal gang members
Fair
who are
enough.
being put in those conditions, and
Well,
that is
and
abhorrent.
due process doesn't stop with incarceration, right? It's like
Correct.
so so as long as the law is being followed, and I think that I think we're in a good spot actually. Due
Okay.
process is paramount, and we agree that you shouldn't be injuring people, hurting people, torturing people just for the sake of hurting them, and that both parties should be allowed to get over there and take a look and make sure everything's copacetic, and that the AEA, invoking the AEA, was probably not the smartest strategy. So, but overall, we agree that if you've come to this country and you are here illegally and you're committing crimes, you got to go.
Yeah.
You got to go.
100%.
That's good.
100%.
That's a good place to stop, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Any last word from you?
No, no, no. Very
Okay.
good.
Thanks for joining us, and
Take
we'll see you next time around.